So today's guest on the Keen on Yoga podcast is Andrea Pennington. Before we start, as usual, if this episode interests you in any way, don't forget to comment as well as head on over to YouTube channel at Keen on Yoga to see the video version and keep up to date with all our interviews. We're constantly adding new content. So today's guest, a medical doctor born and brought up in the US and now living in the south of France, actually just down the road from us. Here in Marseille, she's living in Saint-Tropez. Andrea's story is remarkable. An extraordinarily high achiever, she completed her medical degree and then went on with her mother, who is also a doctor, to open centres treating addiction with a mix of allopathic and alternative treatments. It's really interesting. Then at some point she got into TV presenting as a health-based TV consultant, shows for the Discovery Channel, as well as appearing numerous times as the medical consultant on the Oprah Winfrey Show. However, having suffered from what she calls a high-functioning depression from a young age, in the end something gave. And this really happened after an evening of spontaneous performance, singing, she's also a talented musician actually, to an audience whilst on holiday in Saint-Tropez. And faced with the prospect of returning home to continue in TV in the US, in her hotel room she went through a kind of pivotal experience, first defined by despair in her situation, which gradually opened up to giving her literally, actually, a vision of a new beginning here in France. So she packed up and moved over 10 years ago now, to the south of France and hasn't looked back. She now works combining her medical knowledge with her later trainings in holistic therapies, yoga and meditation in order to help people not only recover from anxiety, depression and burnout, but also to access the highest creative potential, something she's really passionate about, to have the courage and confidence to finding their way back to life and realigning with their true calling in it. So, without further ado, welcome Andrea to the Keen on Yoga podcast. Really nice to have you. Right, so welcome Dr. Andrea Pennington. It's wonderful to see you. And I don't really know where to start. You've done so much with your life. But I suppose, my wife asked me yesterday, what's he a doctor of? Because most people are doctors, and they, you kind of assume that, but you are actually a medical doctor as well as everything else, So do you want to just walk me through your training and your early years before you came into the current incarnation that you are now?
Yes, there have been multiple incarnations. Yeah. Well, I started off as a performing artist as a child all the way through university. And in my university years, because my mother was also a physician, I kind of wanted to follow in her footsteps. So I did pre-med. I went to medical school in the United States, and my first career in medicine was pediatrics. And then I quickly shifted to adult medicine when I started treating eating disorders and addiction. And then I got certified in age management and hormone optimization and did that for several years, and then started seeing that the same challenges around addiction and eating disorders were coming up with like major superstars and executives who went into burnout. And that led me to really focus on trauma recovery and self-love, which is where I'm focused now. And it's been a very windy road, including now I'm doing psychedelic assisted therapy and so many things. Yeah. It's wonderful. To be honest, it was coming into the path of psychedelics with MDMA and then ayahuasca for myself, for my own healing journey. I kept it private for several years. But as I have progressed in my journeys, and after sitting with psilocybin or magic mushrooms, I really got a strong calling to facilitate healing with other people, especially people in the BIPOC community.
Yeah, we used to do that when we were young, but in a less structured way, I think. So I suppose the obvious question is, what led you first of all to break away from medicine? And and when you said there's this real schism I noticed with you, or with creativity and a steady scientific job, background, career, and I think that comes from your upbringing. And you mentioned many times in other podcasts and episodes chats with people, your father, and his ideas about, creativity and money earning, etc. So maybe just speak on that for a second.
Yeah, so I basically have lived two parallel lives in this one body. I think I naturally am a performer and a teacher. I love it. My mother, fortunately, encouraged that. I was playing piano. She always came to my events and recitals. But my father, as you mentioned, was very heavy on education. And he felt like the safe route for his children was to focus on education and not the arts. Now, to his credit, he had grown up in Tennessee, lived in Reno, Nevada, and seen a lot of big acts come into town. And he realized that to make it in entertainment, it's like 1 in a million. So, he was a young father. He wanted to keep us safe. So he pushed us towards education. And for me, I know that I have always been an artist. So I was able to do that alongside with pre-med as long as my grades were good, which created a whole sense of perfectionism that we'll talk about another time. But yeah, he had a strong influence in that. And early in my career, I felt like I had to focus on medicine. And of course, I did when I got to medical school. It was really hard and really competitive. But I started noticing that every time I wanted to do something creative, I would have this like internal fear, like, no, that's not safe. And it really created, like you said, a schism. There was this sense of warfare going on internally, my soul wanting to just express and explore. And then this ego that's like, no, we need to stay safe.
But he was actually a performer himself, wasn't he? A musician, like a talented. So he wasn't like, he wasn't interested in the arts and creativeness. You have that in your background. Which is interesting. I mean, and what happened at the university? You mentioned the perfectionism. You mentioned, I liked the joke about the degrees and the thermometer. She's got more degrees than a thermometer. You are like an incredible achiever, but at a point in university, I think that, it started to all catch up with you.
Yeah, it's not university. Actually, when I was in med school.
Sorry, your training.
It really got to me. Because, it's different in the UK, the way university and med school.
They go together.
Right?
Yeah. You do part of it. Yeah.
For us in America, you do 4 years university and then you go to specialty school. So it was that for me when I got to medical school and I was just sort of a one-track mind, only focused on my studies. I started to feel, depression. And it's interesting because even though I was originally prescribed antidepressant medications, the doctor who prescribed them remembered me from my interviews when I did my med school interviews. And she was like, wait a minute, aren't you the one that has like classical piano in your background? How often are you playing piano? And I was like, I'm not playing piano at all. All I can do is study. And she was like, well, why don't you play for like 30 minutes a day? And even that, I was like, what? I can't do 30 minutes a day. She's like, okay, 30 minutes a week. And I wish I had caught on then to understand that for me, my greatest antidepressant is music, it's exploration, it's expression. But it was after I completed medical school, I was working for Discovery Channel, I was doing a lot of creative things, but then the next piece of me that came forward was this spiritual seeker and teacher. And I was discovering that there was a lot of information coming out, like major NIH studies about mindfulness meditation, helping with pain, addiction, heart problems. And at the time, as the medical director at Discovery Health Channel, I was hosting the news and documentaries. And I wanted to bring over this information, but they were not ready. No. They were way too conservative. And for me, I felt like, I'm on television all around America. And if I can't tell people the whole truth, it was creating, again, this sense of angst and frustration within me. Because one of my highest values is integrity. It's wholeness, it's alignment. So that's when I really started to feel like, okay, I'm not being true to myself and I'm not being true in my expression. And that created a lot of anxiety.
And and this was after you were working in trauma units, right? So...
Well, at that point, yes, I had just started the wellness center with my mom. And I wasn't working in like trauma as in car accident trauma. I was working in emotional trauma. And in our wellness center, we were helping people with addiction and eating disorders. And many of them did have, trauma, significant traumas in their background.
And I mean, did you feel that the medicine was lacking in its approach, or I mean, I suppose what I'm trying to say is, how did you shift out of medicine towards your current inclination, and what's good in the medicine that you use now, and what have you brought to it or amended?
Well, the shift, I'm sorry, I didn't follow your train of thought originally, but the shift came for me in my 4th year of medical school. My mother, as I mentioned, was already a physician, and she was learning acupuncture for drug and alcohol detox as part of her work as the medical director for the Georgia Mental Health Institute. So she was telling me on the phone that people were detoxing, I mean, like from opioids, from cocaine, like serious stuff, with just these little ear acupuncture needles.
Incredible.
And I was like, that's not possible, Mom. Wow. Like, I had just done my psych rotation. I'd seen people, and I mean, we've all seen the movies. People are a mess.
Oh yeah,
physiologically.
I was a nurse for a while, so I've seen it. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah,
it's not pretty.
They're the worst. Of any, you think they're dying. You say, what's wrong with this person? You come in and they say, oh, they're just detoxing. You think they're on their last legs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So to hear that my mother was detoxing patients as outpatients, they weren't even in the hospital, they weren't hooked up to an IV. And I got home and visited her, and I said, okay, I want you to give me the same treatment. I wasn't addicted to drugs or anything, but I was curious. And you'll appreciate this as a yogi, I had that same rush of this kundalini, this flush on my face and tears just streaming down my cheeks. And I was like, what is this? So in my 4th year of medical school, I convinced the dean to let me go to New York and study with Dr. Michael Smith, who at the time was a pioneer in bringing acupuncture to the West, specifically for drug and alcohol detox. And so even when I graduated, I already had this sort of awakening that there's more to the mind and the body than what they were teaching us in the traditional system. So when my mother and I opened the center together, we had acupuncture, we had behavior modification, we had psychiatry and psychology, as well as a holistic spa. So it was during those first couple of years that I realized we needed to integrate all of this together. Lifestyle management, stress management, dealing with our past programming, as well as, of course, taking care of the physical body as it stands, nutrition and fitness and sleep and hydration. And it was during that time that I could appreciate that when you're in a real emergency situation, Western medicine or allopathic medicine is great. There's some wonderful benefits.
You probably wouldn't use homeopathy if you're in a car crash. Absolutely. Yeah, there are. But I mean, it's big stuff, right? For the emotional stuff, and for, you don't need a sledgehammer,
Exactly. Yeah. And there's a lot of things that we can actually prevent and treat ourselves. Like the human body is amazing at self-healing. We each have an innate vitality code that will put the body into a healing and recovery phase if we stop blocking it. And so that's all of that sort of background, and then having practical experience with my patients is what led me to realize we have to live with this more holistic approach.
And I mean, you've spoken about having trauma. I mean, everyone's got trauma in their upbringing, right? Regardless of how, your parents sound well-wishing and great, but inevitably, maybe not. Inevitably, one inherits trauma regardless. And how have you related to that? I mean, you're working with trauma a great deal now, childhood trauma, and what's the biggest tools that you can say that will help people advance? Help people break out of these patterns. Because I mean, I was at university, fell into the same kind of depression, as a very high achiever. I'd always got, I'd been given a place at Oxbridge, and I didn't, I couldn't cope anymore, and so they put me in the talking therapy, they put me in the antidepressants, and nothing changed. Nothing changed really. I was very good at talking my way out of things, until I found yoga, and it was that made the difference. So I'm wondering, what your real shift has been through working through your own traumas.
Wow, that's great. I'm happy that you found yoga.
Yeah, it was bloody lucky, actually. It wasn't going well before that with the antidepressants and the alcohol and the drugs. Yeah, it wasn't pretty. Yeah.
I get that. I get that on so many levels. Well, yes, we all live with trauma, big T trauma, as in physical or sexual abuse or witnessing something really devastating, to the minor everyday traumas. What I didn't realize is how much my family background impacted me. So yes, my parents were indeed very well-wishing and well-intentioned, but each of them brought to their marriage a lot of baggage and emotional wounding. My mother lost my grandmother when my mom was just 11 years old. She never fully healed from that wound. She was also rejected by her father. My father was the child of an alcoholic, and nobody talked about it. And all of those sort of traumatic experiences were transmitted to their children. And my parents got divorced when I was 3, and I never thought that was a big deal because I saw so many other families in our neighborhood where the parents were divorced. But what I now know is, based on the research done with the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences, if you happen to grow up in a family where before the age of 18, there was a physical or sexual abuse, there was poverty, if there was a divorce or loss of a parent, perhaps due to death or to suicide, and a whole host of things, that all of those, even though they may seem like trivial traumas, they impact our brain, our nervous system, our cardiovascular system, and our immune system. And so it was, as I was hearing my patients, we had some of the same symptoms. I felt the same sense of depression and not enoughness and unsatisfactoriness, but I didn't have the major traumas that they did. But when I really started to uncover, like, we all had this profound feeling that we were not good enough and that we were unlovable. And it was that really led me to do my own work. And so when you ask, what does anyone do who has any sort of trauma, big or small, we always start with self-awareness, like really looking at your family history from what might have genetically been passed on, but also the environment that you grew up in. Did you have loving and responsive parents? And if not, how has that impacted you? Were there any attachment wounds with your primary caregivers? Because all of those set us up for compensating behaviors, perfectionism, overachiever, all of that sort of people pleaser, like all of those behavioral reactions come from our early life experiences. And if we don't look at them, self-awareness is about just looking at what is so, not blaming yourself or your parents. I mean, I don't blame them. I understand where they went wrong and why, and I have immense compassion, but I had to understand it for myself so that I could finally put it in its correct context, so that I wasn't any longer being a victim or always being this compulsive people pleaser. I had to get out of that codependent dance by just sitting with what was so and learning to accept, okay, that was then, this is now. I'm the conscious chooser of my life experience going forward. So that's been the biggest shift for me, because what I noticed in my medical practice was, if people did not love themselves, if they did not believe that they were worthy of health and vitality, it doesn't matter what I do for you. It doesn't matter what drug, what treatment, what psychotherapy, like you and I, we did the talk therapy, we did the antidepressants. If you don't get to that fundamental root, then everything you throw at them will not work, or it will not stick.
It's really interesting stuff. I've got so many things to ask you, but I suppose the obvious thing is, you talk of this, again, we go back to the schism between the arts and the creativity, and you're very much into, from looking at what you put out there, the creative purpose, right? Finding your creative purpose. And, many times I've heard you talk about this point in time when you were in France, you were in Cannes, where you are now, and you went on the stage and you were very depressed, I think, at the time, and you happen to have a great night singing and expressing yourself, and I've heard you sing, and it's fucking amazing, actually. And and then and I understand this sentiment that happens next as well. And then after having that time, you go back and you know you've got to go home, and it just all comes crowding in because you've had such a, you know, in polarity to that great time you had, you know, you kind of feel like you can't cope anymore with your life, and you also, I mean, and you were doing incredible stuff. I mean, you're an Oprah Winfrey, you know, you were, you know, I mean, just a very high achieving life, and but you were saying you're finding it hard to get up in the morning and put a face on, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a cliche, but it's very true.
And for many.
Had been at the pinnacle of success, and it was meaningless. It was empty, and I felt miserable inside. But it's exactly what you described, that polarity between being on stage. And it wasn't just that I had a great time. Adam, it was, I felt for the first time in years, I felt like my true self. And I felt accepted and seen as my true self. Because here I am, I'm singing to a bunch of party goers that I don't know. I know I'll never see them again. But there was this sense of cohesion, this sense of bliss and acceptance. And they didn't know me. They didn't read my bio. They had no clue who I was. And yet I felt more seen and accepted than I'd felt in years. And more seen and accepted than I felt in America, even though I was on TV every single day. And so it was that polarity, getting back to my hotel room going like, what the? Like, I got to go back into this prison. And that's when I lost it. That's when I really threw my hands up and said, God, you know, I can't do this. You're going to have to take my life.
Yeah. And an incredible moment, because if you really, I think, you know, and because I've been there as well. And I think if you really say that and you really, you come into that point of utter not knowing and kind of just, you know, despair, but not in despair in necessarily in a kind of active suicidal way, but just like, I don't know anymore, you know, and from there, there's that, you know, there's that creativity that you know, everything seemed to change for me from that point.
Yeah, it did, because as I flung myself on the bed, crying out to God to take my life, I did not have any plans of suicide, but I did want my life to end. I had already made an agreement with life that I wouldn't take my own life, so I asked God to do it, like, take it. I don't know what I'm doing with it. And when I left my body and went into this bright white light and then over to the other side, I had this near-death experience that so many people describe, of seeing my life reviewed in just a millisecond, and then coming to understand that we are all little droplets of God consciousness, little droplets of light, or the soul essence. And when we incarnate, it's up to us to determine who we will be. And when I got that awareness, it was like, it seemed so obvious, like, oh, duh, I can choose my life. But it wasn't very clear to me back then. I had had my life steered by my parents, and in the school system, and in the medical society, and in the media. But in that moment of surrender, when my ego was completely out of the way, my soul was like, okay, if I can go back and choose, I'll go and choose differently. And that's when I saw a whole vision for my future. I saw in just full technicolor, I saw a vision of me walking hand in hand with a child, which was weird because I was almost 35 and single. Right. I'm like, okay, I have a child in this vision. And in this future vision, I was singing professionally and healing with my hands. Now, the last part was a little weird because I'm like, wait, God, you're going to make me a woo-woo doctor now? You know, I had been so prided on my scientific background, but it looked so amazing that I was like, you know what? I'll take that life. And I instantly came back into my body, and that dark cloud of depression was gone. And that's when I made this commitment to live with my truth. And a couple of months later, I had met and fallen in love with the father of my child. And a couple of years after that, my daughter and I moved here to the south of France, where we've now lived for 11 years.
Oh, it's that long. I didn't know you'd been around. Right, okay. Right. Wow. That's incredible. And just from that moment, everything shifted.
Absolutely. Everything from that moment. And of course, when I became pregnant that year, it was even more solidified. It was like, I am not going to live an inauthentic life, because I know that children model what we do, not what we say, it's what we do. And I was committed to live an authentic life. So I shifted the way I did my work. I ended up closing the wellness center so that I could be a full-time mom for the first few years and really just be present with my daughter. And from that day forward, it's changed everything. It's changed the way I work, the types of clients I take on, and obviously the kind of work that I do.
How do people find the courage, first of all, to even consider looking for their purpose, right? I mean, it seems like many people are probably going to reflect, well, that's a nice idea, right? That's a privilege that, I don't have the possibility of even debating with myself, right? To find my true purpose is like, I've got responsibilities, I've got bills to pay. I don't know what the hell to do, like I'm just working this job because I got to, like, where do we go from here? And how, and do you think everyone has a purpose? And how do we start to intuit that purpose? And how do we begin to have the courage to do so?
I believe all of us, all beings come here with a purpose. And not all of them have to be big and lofty, running your own company or whatever, but we each have a purpose, whether that is really to be fully present as a parent. For a few years of my life, that was my sole purpose. Over time, my purpose has evolved to where I am now, leading other luminaries and coaches into the media and such. I think there are two pieces of your question that I want to get to. Number one, in my case, it wasn't courageous. A lot of people say that, like, oh my God, you were so courageous. You left the practice of medicine, you left media, you left America, took your child. For me, it wasn't bravery. That was an absolute must to live in alignment with my soul. And the reason I say that is because I think for people who feel like maybe finding your purpose is a luxury, there will likely come a point in your life where something shifts. Either you see somebody else die, or you see somebody else rocking their purpose, and you see them like living, you're like, wait a minute. We each come to a moment where it's like the hero's journey. We get this calling to level up. And for me, that's what it was.
Yeah.
I had no other choice. I already didn't want to live my life.
Yeah.
For me, I had no other choice.
Yes. I mean, I said that I suppose inauthentically in a way, because that's exactly how I came to experience what I'm doing. It's just there comes to a point where there's no other option, so it's not courage. People, because people have said the same thing. It's not. It's just that is, unfortunately, that is not usually framed in the positive. That you see, like everything's going fine, and you see something else, like, oh, that's even better. Like, it's usually like, well, really, there's no other way out. Is this or just darkness, And I was going to ask before, actually, from the point of the catharsis and the new beginning on the bed, was that the first point when the depression finally shifted? Because you'd kind of carried that along with you, as I understand, since the med school, and your professional career in different incarnations of that, and it wasn't shifting.
Exactly. Yeah, the depression for me actually started in childhood. It was never fully labeled as such, but now that I know what I know, I can see that there was this deep sadness from my childhood all the way into my early 30s. But after that moment in 2005, the depression never returned like that. I did have some baby blues or postnatal depression that impacted me, but nothing like what I went through before, where I didn't want my life. And I can say that, that's now 16 years that I've been able to live not on antidepressants, not waking up dreading my life. Like, that's really significant for me.
Absolutely. I said it's a result. And what about, the part of my question, it was qualified, I think, in 3 parts, wasn't it? So the other part of the question is, how do we come into start intuiting or, even considering what our purpose might be other than what's right in front of us that we have to do? Because day in, day out, it's like you've got a certain task you have to do. It doesn't feel like there's much space, even for me, like coming into new territory. Oftentimes it's like you've got these things in your day and you don't really have that a space to dream, as it were, or even trust those little intuitions necessarily.
Yeah. There are 4 things on my list. The first one would be breath work. Second would be meditation. Third would be yoga. And the fourth is journaling. Combine all of them, and you've got like a super powered way to learn how to really go within to start to hear your authentic self, the voice of your soul. Like breath work is just a beautiful mindful practice that is any beginner can do. And of course, you know this as an expert, like just focusing on the breath can bring us into this present moment and start to quiet down the chatter in our monkey mind enough that we might start to hear or intuit or feel something. And again, you may not know how to define it and you may judge it as crazy. I will say for me, when I started to feel like I wanted to get back on TV and back on stage, I was already living here in the south of France. And one morning I was sitting in meditation and I just felt this kind of rumbling, this kind of, all I could say is it was a feeling. It was a calling to get back on TV. And at first I went into judgment. I was like, oh, you just miss being a big star on TV, huh? And as I went back and I sat with my breath on my meditation cushion, it was like, no, this is not my ego speaking. This is my heart, because I love performing and teaching and expressing. And that was when I realized, okay, this is a part of me. This is divine. I didn't feel like it was coming from my ego. So I find that, you know, doing these things and certainly doing, I mean, you could also do just connecting in nature, gardening, being out with, you know, the elements. But being on a yoga mat is a beautiful way to really hear that inner voice, that inner calling. And, you know, we've helped so many amazing yogis like share their message with the world. And I'm always inspired when I hear about the transformation that happens. It's not just while being on the mat. Obviously, being on the yoga mat is where you do the training, but it's the revelations that you hear about what that meant in the rest of their lives. And so those are the four things that I would recommend. If you really wanted to start to hear and trust your own gut and heart, your soul, to find that intuitive nudge toward your purpose, those are the four things I'd recommend.
It's funny because I picked up a pen after years. I mean, I was an academic, kind of pathway before I found yoga. And as I said, it kind of wasn't going well at university. And so I kind of stopped writing and reading. And then more latterly, I picked up the pen and I started writing in. You could call it journaling or, and yeah, it's been incredible, actually. Equally as powerful as the yoga. I mean, really, so I totally recommend to anyone, do a bit of creative writing, whatever it is. And it just starts to kind of bring stuff out, right?
Yeah, that has inspired me to write books. I think we've written and published 13 books since I moved to France. So it just flows.
What about you talk about neurofeedback? Do you want to talk about that? As I understand it, it's like putting electrodes onto your head. Is that right? Yeah. Are you still doing that?
Well,
it kind of sounded interesting.
I am.
Right, okay.
I am. The nerd in me cannot go away. That part is here to stay. A few years ago, I read this book by C. Maxwell Cade, who is a British physicist and Zen master. And I was reading about how he was hooking up EEG sensors on the heads of yogis, mediums, other healers. And he and a partner had developed the very first kind of consumer EEG. And they could see the brainwave patterns on this electroencephalogram. And they started to recognize that certain types of meditation and breath work and visualization could get you into brainwave patterns that he and his protege ended up calling the awakened mind. So Anna Weiss learned in England and then moved to America. And a few years ago, when I was reading his book, I met someone who trained with Anna Weiss. And I was like, oh my God, I want to get one of these. So I went to Pennsylvania and I sat down with Judith Pennington, no relation, same last name, really amazing, from the Institute for the Awakened Mind. And I got trained on doing this EEG neurofeedback. So as you said, you put these sensors on your head, and then as you're listening either to a guided meditation or you could just do it on your own, the computer program will give you little feedback, little audio cues that let you know if you're getting into the brainwave pattern that you desire. And I found it fascinating because I've been meditating since university. But with the biofeedback training, I noticed I could get faster and more reliably into these deeper states of meditation. And recently, I've been trying out the consumer version of the Mind Mirror. It's called Muse. And it's a little bit of a different system, not as techy as the Mind Mirror, but it's really elegant because we can train ourselves. And even without using EEG, after a while, you just train your body and your brain to get back into that regulated nervous system state. I love it because now that I bring it into my workshops around the world, we can hook people up and they can see what happens when they get into these different brainwave patterns. And I just find it fascinating because what it proves that we have the power to transform our own health and vitality. And we can see that proof. Of course, we know longtime meditators and yogis, we know what their health looks like. But if you could do this and after just a couple of weeks, you could see visibly your results, well, we find that that's a huge motivator for people.
Faith, if you look at, I was thinking of the Yoga Sutras actually, when Patanjali actually says, what you need is, first of all, you need faith. Shraddha is the first thing you need. Shraddha, Virya, Smriti, you need faith, you need vigor, you need effort. And then you need reflection or inquiry or awareness, right? So, in faith is huge, because, without faith, or as you say, like in, kind of common parlance, motivation, or, you can't continue. And what you need is consistent effort, right? Over a reasonable period of time, which I'm sure, even though you had the awakening on the bed, it's taking you a long time to put everything together and come to a place of solidity that you can really, with your hand on your heart, go out and teach people these things and affect change, for others, which you are. What's the one, can you say one thing that has been the most fundamentally surprising thing in your work, in terms of how you change, how people have or haven't changed, or,
I would say the most surprising thing for me in my work has happened since I moved to France. And it happened after that period in meditation where I was feeling like I need to get out there. And that was in doing my first TED Talk, where I opened up about my experience with depression and anxiety. And I told the whole world that I had this near-death experience. I did that for myself, just to clear the slate so that as I came back into the media, people would have a different reference. They wouldn't keep referencing my old media image. I had no idea, and I've been completely surprised at how much that opened up my heart and the hearts of other people. So it shifted everything, including my business. Like I now have the Authentic Personal Branding Bootcamp, where I'm helping people tell their personal stories. I never would have dreamed that talking about my wounds would have transformed other people's lives.
It does.
And my own.
It does. Yeah.
And it sounds like if someone had told me that, actually, somebody did tell me that. I remember somebody telling me my mother had Alzheimer's disease and passed away in September. And when things were really getting dicey, I took a little break from media, and I remember somebody in Hollywood telling me, "Oh, you should blog about your experience." And there was just something about it that just seemed wrong. And I know a lot of people were doing that. A lot of people share their experience. But for me personally, it felt wrong for me. It was like, no, I don't want to share what's going on with my mom and how I'm dealing with it. A few years in, after I had my first TED Talk, and it was realizing that I had opened up a whole line of communication for people that made me more accessible to them and more relatable to them. And suddenly people were saying, yeah, I'm also a high achiever, but I'm lacking in this area. And how did you do this? So it transformed the way that I started doing business. And that has been the most shocking thing ever.
Really? That's funny.
For both reasons.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think because one, it helped me grow a very successful coaching business. And number two, it was also healing for me. Because as I opened up, it allowed me to sit with other people in 12-step meetings and really go deep on my own personal journey and uncover hidden wounds that I had no idea were impacting my relationships, my finances, my confidence, all of it.
It's so strange though, because when you listen to the talk, and it's a great talk, it's clear, it's calm. In no way does it feel like you've just done that one time, or you're just opening up at that very time. I mean, you don't seem nervous at all, or anyway emotive, about it. It's like you've done it. It's just like you've done it 100 times. I'm sure you were at the time, right? But it doesn't. Reflecting on it, like I'm talking to you now and looking at the talk as I did yesterday. You would never know. You would never know. It's very fascinating, right? Does everyone need a creative outlet, do you think? I mean, you've got many, and you talk about creativity a lot. And many people will say, I don't have, I don't have any kind of creative pastime, or, I don't feel creative, or, do you think everyone needs it? And how do we encourage that part of ourselves?
You know what? I'm not sure. I'll be honest. I think I attract and I resonate with creative people. So like all the people in my life, they have something, whether they're creative gardeners or they know how to cook amazing meals and they add a lot of creativity. I think everyone in my circle has some level of creativity. So I would feel like my gut would say, of course, because I can see it in my clients. When they tap into their creativity, everything else in their life flourishes, just like it did with mine. So I don't know about people who don't have some creative pastime, but even just listening to music or appreciating a good film or a good book, that's tapping into that creativity. So, but I'll be honest, that's my response there. I think
it's difficult because I think these days we're all encouraged that everyone has to fulfill their purpose, their dream, their, individuate themselves, right? And be a big, make a big thing, like, of themselves. And I don't, and I think it puts a lot of pressure, it puts a lot of pressure on the individual to be something particular, something special in the eyes of the world, right? Rather than just, be quietly their own thing and quietly resonate with themselves,
Yeah. But I think what you're saying is important to highlight, because even if we're just doing something that the outside world might think of as small, it doesn't mean it's insignificant.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And one of the ways I was really brought home to this, coming to the south of France, where everything moves a little bit slower than America. I remember going to a boulangerie, the bakery, wanting to get, some stuff before my daughter went to school. And so I was kind of in an American hurry. And as I saw this little guy go up to the counter, and he ordered his little cafe and his croissant and his baguette. And at first I was irritated, but then I looked. And I looked at the woman, and she knew him, and she recognized him, and she nodded, and she got him his stuff. And as he walked away, I realized he's taking that back to his wife, who maybe can't get out today or doesn't want to. And that interaction has just helped him, and maybe even helped his wife. And who knows, that little interaction. And so are you going to tell me that the woman at the bakery wasn't living her purpose? Like, even if you were a track star or a movie star, someone still had to serve you your coffee. And if you were, some surgeon, every little interaction that we have is meaningful and purposeful. And yeah, so I feel like, don't worry if it doesn't seem like it's this big, huge thing that you're living. Sometimes our purpose is just to be this presence of love on the planet, and to beam that. To send that
and
out.
The purpose can get in the way of actually living, right? Like, you're so involved in your purpose, right? I've got to get there, here, I've got to do this. You don't actually open up to life in that moment, right? Which is always just about small connections with people, But it's funny. I mean, I have that experience at the boulangerie all the time. And they give great service, but it's very slow. It's, and they talk, it doesn't matter if you've got 10 people behind, they'll have a little chat. And, it's so different to the UK and I'm sure US, where it's just like efficiency is everything. But where are you going with all that efficiency? Where is it exactly? Once you've got that extra time, it goes on people just watching TV or just trying to kill that time, So yeah, it is very different here. I don't even want to ask you how your French is going, because I'm sure that you're mistaken for a native speaker by now, as I struggle with my grammar still.
Well, I've been speaking French since I was a kid, so
right, yeah. God. Lastly, what about this? You use this word resilience a lot, and it crops up a lot in the way you talk, and I like it. I don't fully understand. I'd like to hear more about about this word and what it means for you. Yeah.
Sure. Resilience is a natural capacity that we're all born with. Resilience is the ability to bounce back after adversity, accidents, illness, injury, surgery. And each of us are born with a set of resources or skills that make us resilient. As I mentioned before, we each have our own innate vitality code, meaning all the way into your DNA, there is a code for your body to return to homeostasis, to return to a baseline. And in my research, working with huge superstars and normal people, I identified 10 traits of resilience that if we focus on them, we can enhance our ability to bounce back after challenges, but even bounce forward with post-traumatic growth.
I like it because someone once said to me, I wouldn't say you're strong, they said, but you're very resilient. And I thought, it stuck with me ever since, because I thought that's really true, because I'm emotionally, like I'm quite out there, and my power, as you said, my power is being emotionally open, it helped me incredibly, but yeah, I would say that resilience is something which everyone has if they can tap into it, and it doesn't mean that you don't have emotional feelings or vulnerability. It's not the same thing, you see, showing vulnerability actually helps with resilience,
Absolutely. One of the top 10 traits of highly resilient people, one is positive emotion. The other one is tolerance and compassion. Like the more of that we have this greater capacity to broaden our awareness and bring more skills to challenging life situations and to problem solving.
Well, Andrea, we've almost run out of time, and I reckon I could talk to you for ages about loads of different things, but I want to ask you, I usually ask a couple of questions at the end, but I want to ask you an extra one. Who, out of well-known figures that you might have spoken to or talked to, and I know you've rubbed shoulders with the stars for many years, who impressed you most, or was there a particular action or something that struck you out with someone that really inspired you or impressed you, that someone you met?
Oh gosh, there are so many to think through. I think one that comes to mind today is Beyonce. When I met her and spent some time with Jay-Z way back when I still lived in Washington, D.C., she had come and performed there. And this was the same time that she was still using this alter ego, Sasha Fierce. And now that I do so much work with archetypes, I can really appreciate that having this alter ego, Sasha Fierce, when she stepped on stage, she lit up the arena. It was one of the best concerts I'd ever been to. But then when she came back to where Jay-Z and I were hanging out in the VIP, it was like she came in as this very sweet, demure, the Beyonce that we knew back then. And it really struck me the power of activating these alter egos or archetypes. And in fact, I've built a whole hero collective membership helping people tune into these archetypes. So that one comes to mind.
That's really interesting, kind of like Joseph Campbell, kind of. Yeah. Okay, and my classic two questions. Give me a guilty pleasure, and don't say you don't have any guilt. Something that's like a little throwaway thing that you like to do for fun, not for any achieving, right? That's the tough one. And also it's something that inspires you. It could be a place, a person, a book, or something that comes to mind. So just to wrap up our time together.
Well, this guilty pleasure is actually creating little videos. Like not just work stuff, but I love getting, I have an app on my phone and I just create little silly videos, sometimes on TikTok, mostly on Instagram.
Splice them together,
Yeah. Just sometimes I'll have an inspiration, an idea I want to share and I'll do it. And I don't know why it's guilty, but it's my guilty pleasure.
Just mucking around. Yeah, it's still achieving, really. That's not half as guilty as most people's guilty pleasure, really. But it's not bad, Okay, and your inspiration? Something that keeps you inspired when you feel a little bit, low of energy or down,
I would say the biggest inspiration for me is my family right now. Yeah, when I'm wondering, like, okay, who cares about all the stuff I'm doing, out in the world? I tuned back into my daughter, my beloved, the rest of my family back in the US. And I realized, okay, yeah, this is my inspiration to keep going, to keep shining, to keep sharing.
Beautiful. All right. Well, thanks for giving your time. I've really, really enjoyed meeting you and speaking to you. Thank you, Andrea. Thanks for coming on.
It's been a pleasure.